Let's take a quick look now at chronic adaptations and some of the exam questions or an exam question that you might get with it. Firstly, you might see it written as chronic adaptation, chronic meaning long term, or you might just see it written as adaptations. And there's a few points to start out here. Firstly, adaptation is a change that occurs within the body. And what happens is when we place stress on the body in the form of exercise, the body needs to be able to cope with that stress better. So it makes changes to allow the body to be able to deal with that particular stress that's being placed on the body. It's very specific to the type of training undertaken. So if you're undergoing endurance type training, then the benefits or the adaptations you will make will be specific to that type of training, and similarly to anaerobic. It's also really specific to the muscle groups that's being used. So if you're doing exercises, for example, resistance exercises, maybe we call them beach weights, so a lot of the front of body work, so a lot of bench work and everyone's favorite bicep curls. If you do that sort of work, you'll get hypertrophy and strength gains in those areas, but if you don't balance that with work on the back as well, then that can lead to some a lack of alignment within the body. So it really is specific. You really do get out what you put into training, and the changes occur within the three body systems, so the cardiovascular, the respiratory, and the muscular system. But there'll be another little tutorial about those and go into some more specific detail with each of those systems. Basically what happens is the body makes changes so that the work becomes easier. The body is more efficient at being able to cope with load, at being able to cope with work, and so it gets easier. And you can feel those changes when you undertake a training program. When you run, it feels easier to run. You can run faster. When you do work with weights or resistance work, the load feels lighter, or it feels like it's easier to move through your range of motion. Importantly, adaptations are reversible, and a good way of thinking about this is if you don't use it, you lose it. And it's important to note as well that you lose adaptations aerobically faster than anaerobic, or faster than strength gains there. Now, in order to make these adaptations, you can't just undertake a training program and expect yourself to constantly improve. Sure, you will at the start, but what you need to do is apply what's called overload or progressive overload, and that needs to be applied correctly in order to achieve gains. Let's take a look at this idea here. So what we've got, the line that goes straight across and it goes from the left-hand side, the baseline fitness line, is where you start at. And when you undergo a training, you become fatigued. So we're looking at the downward slope there, and that's fatigue generated by placing an overload within the training program. Now that is called the catabolic effect, or it's a breakdown effect. What happens after there's a breakdown is that the body rebuilds, it overcompensates, and it's really important that the athlete undergoes rest and recovery at that time. And we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes and a couple of slides later. But the body rebuilds, and it's called an anabolic effect when the body rebuilds to overcompensate. And you'll see that the adaptation means that their actual fitness level goes above their baseline fitness. And we've got a new baseline fitness there. If the athlete doesn't undergo the same level of training after that adaptation has occurred, then you'll get what's called reversibility, where the athlete will revert back to their baseline, or perhaps even dip below their baseline if they don't undergo any training. So that's sort of the essence of what we're talking about in terms of adaptation. And now we want to talk about the overload that's applied to a training program or applied to an individual in order to achieve a constant improvement. And we know we can get an inconstant improvement to a certain point because we've got what's called this genetic ceiling that our body's able to reach, but then we can't go above that without help from illegal substances, that's for sure. So we call that diminishing returns. The closer you get to your genetic ceiling, the fewer gains that you get. So we're tying in a few principles of training into this particular topic area. First of all, if we just have a little look at what progressive overload is actually defined as. So the gradual increase of stress, and stress can be in the form of load, it can be in the form of intensity, reps or sets placed upon the body during exercise training. So that's a nice little definition to look at. And how it occurs here is what we're looking at. We're looking at something really similar to that adaptation graph that we just looked at a couple of slides ago, where we've got our baseline fitness. We place stress on the body. It undergoes a catabolic effect, breaks down. Anabolic effect, rebuilds. And then we've got what's called a peak of overcompensation that occurs at the top. So where those arrows are the top. The body's compensated, and what we want to do is we want to apply progressive overload at that point in time, the peak of overcompensation. And people often ask, well, how do you know when you're at that peak of overcompensation? It's a little bit challenging. the best way to think about it is that the work becomes easier. When work becomes easier, then you know that you're ready for the next overload to occur. So how do we apply overload? There's lots of different ways we can do it. We can increase reps, sets, increase the intensity in terms of max heart rate, or increase the load if we're undergoing a resistance program, or we can decrease the rest. What we need to be really careful with rest though, is that we don't want to manipulate the variable so much that we change the focus of the training session. So an example that I've written there is if we're looking at a work to rest ratio of 1:5 or a little bit greater, and we start reducing the rest and we change the work to rest ratio down to 1:4 or 1:3, you change the focus, and the focus of the energy system might shift from the ATP CP system to the anaerobic glycolysis system. And that's because the body hasn't had enough time to replenish the PC stores at a lower work to rest ratio, and therefore it turns to the anaerobic glycolysis system to be the dominant system earlier, and thus you lose focus. And if you lose focus or specificity, you're going to get different adaptations. So it's just really important that you stay true to the essence of what you're trying to achieve within those variables. And the other one is that when you apply overload, you need to only apply it to one variable at a time, and it can only be up to 10% application. So if you're doing 3 sets, we'll make it really easy. If you're doing 3 sets of 10 reps on a particular weight, let's say a wood chop, you're going to go 3 sets of 11 reps. Just make it easy. And if you get an exam question like that, do the easiest one possible to guarantee that you'll get yourself the marks. So if we have appropriate placement of overload at the peak of overcompensation, we will get an increase in fitness. If we apply overload too early in this particular case, indicated by those red arrows, then what we're going to get is we're going to get a situation where the athlete fatigues. They're not going to be able to undergo the training program to the full extent, and they're going to run the risk of overtraining. So it's really important that we get that placement of overload in the correct spot. Similarly, if you apply overload too late, you're not going to get the benefits as well. And you've probably seen a graph like this before. It's in one of the textbooks that talks about each of the individuals in terms of their level of fitness. So obviously we're wanting to go for A because A's got the highest level of fitness at the end. And you can see and have a look through each of those. Maybe even you want to have a pause of this slide and have a look at where overload's applied for each of them, and make sure that you understand that concept, that it needs to be applied correctly to get the most fitness gains. Let's have a look at an exam question. Once again, if you want to pause this particular slide here and read, because there's quite a bit of detail to look at here, and then answer the question, do so. I'm going to go straight through. So the question is, discuss whether or not overload has been correctly applied in this training program. Refer to data in your answer. So for 2 marks, you need to say whether or not it's been applied correctly. That will be for 1 mark. And then you need to refer to the data specifically within your answer for 2 marks. So if we have a look at this particular workout here, workout 1, 2, and 3, and then the weeks 1, 3, 4, and 9. If you look at week 3 and 4, and even just that first session, and you look at the jog, the first jog is 200 meters or 90 seconds, and then the jog in week 4 is 400 meters or 3 minutes. Straight away you can see that that is way more than 10%. So that should give you your first clue that perhaps they're overloading a little bit too much. And then if you keep going down, you look at the number of jogs that have been put in, that also is in week 3. So 2 jogs in week 3, week 1, and then 4 jogs. So there's plenty of information there to tell you that they've overloaded too much, and they've overloaded by more than 10%. If we have a look at the answers, 52% of the state got 0 marks here. No, it's not been applied correctly. That's okay, well and good to say that. But then what you need to say is you need to specifically refer to data. So from week 3 to week 4, it's too great. More than 10%. It's really important that you don't just say that it's too great, because that doesn't show that you understand that it's only 10% that the change can occur within. So you need to specifically show your knowledge and link to data. And we'll say that over and over again with the exam questions. Demonstrate your knowledge and then link to data. So you know that it should only be 10%. So you need to show that you know that and then link to the data. I'd even go further and give an example. They've said there in both distance and time in the jogging intervals, and that would be fine. But if it asks you to refer to data, just put in some exact examples there to give you the marks. And that exam was from 2009, so it's a few years old now. We haven't had too many other questions like that, but students didn't go that well. So hopefully after this, you're okay with it, and we might get a question on it this